Psychologists and neuroscientists now acknowledge that the human mind tends to wander, engaging in what has been called stimulus-independent thought. The primary method of studying mental phenomena of this kind outside the lab is a technique called experience sampling. Using a mobile phone or some other device, subjects are simply prompted to describe what they are doing and how they feel at random intervals throughout the day. One study found that when asked whether their mind was wandering, that is, whether they were thinking about something unrelated to their current experience, subjects reported being lost in thought 46.9% of the time. Anyone who is trained in meditation will know that the true figure is surely higher, especially if we count all the thinking that, while perhaps superficially related to the task at hand, nevertheless constitutes an unnecessary distraction from it. As unreliable as such self-reports must be, this study found that people are consistently less happy when their minds are wandering, even when the contents of their thoughts are pleasant. The authors concluded that, quote, "A human mind is a wandering mind, and a wandering mind is an unhappy mind," end quote. Anyone who has spent time on silent retreat will agree. The wandering mind has been correlated with activities in the brain's midline regions, especially the medial prefrontal cortex and the medial parietal cortex. These areas are often called the default mode or resting state network, because they are most active when we are just biding our time, waiting for something to happen. Activity in the default mode network decreases when subjects concentrate on tasks of the sort employed in most neuroimaging experiments. The default mode network has also been linked with our capacity for self-representation. For instance, if a person believes that she is tall, the term tall should yield greater signal in these midline regions than the term short. Similarly, the default mode network is more engaged when we make such judgments of relevance about ourselves as opposed to making them about other people. It also tends to be more active when we evaluate a scene from a first-person rather than a third-person point of view. Generally speaking, to pay attention outwardly reduces activity in the brain's midline, while thinking about oneself increases it. These results appear mutually reinforcing and might explain the common experience we have of, quote, losing ourselves in our work. Mindfulness and loving-kindness meditation also decrease activity in the default mode network. And the effect is most pronounced among experienced meditators, both while meditating and at rest. While it is too early to draw strong conclusions from these findings, they hint at a physical connection between the experience of being lost in thought and the sense of self, as well as a mechanism by which meditation might reduce both. Long-term meditation practice is also associated with a variety of structural changes in the brain. Meditators tend to have larger corpora callosum and hippocampi in both hemispheres. The practice is also linked to increased gray matter thickness and cortical folding. Some of these differences are especially prominent in older practitioners, which suggests that meditation could protect against age-related thinning of the cortex. The cognitive, emotional, and behavioral significance of these anatomical findings have not yet been worked out, but it is not hard to see how they might explain the kinds of experiences and psychological changes that meditators report. Expert meditators, with greater than 10,000 hours of practice, respond differently to pain than novices do. They judge the intensity of an unpleasant stimulus to be the same, but they find it to be less unpleasant. They also show reduced activity in regions associated with anxiety while anticipating the onset of pain, as well as faster habituation to the stimulus once it arrives. Other research has found that mindfulness reduces both the unpleasantness and intensity of noxious stimuli. It has long been known that stress, especially early in life, alters brain structure. For instance, studies both in animals and in humans have shown that early stress increases the size of the amygdala. One study found that an 8-week program of mindfulness meditation reduced the volume of the right basolateral amygdala, and these changes were correlated with a subjective decrease in stress. Another found that a full day of mindfulness practice among trained meditators reduced the expression of several genes that produce inflammation throughout the body, and this correlated with an improved response to social stress. Diabolically, subjects were asked to give a brief speech and then perform mental calculations while being videotaped in front of an audience. A mere 5 minutes of practice a day for 5 weeks increased left-sided baseline activity in the frontal cortex, a pattern that, as we saw in the discussion of the split brain, has been associated with positive emotions. A review of the psychological literature suggests that mindfulness in particular fosters many components of physical and mental health. It improves immune function, blood pressure, and cortisol levels. It reduces anxiety, depression, neuroticism, and emotional reactivity. It also leads to greater behavioral regulation and has shown promise in the treatment of addiction and eating disorders. Unsurprisingly, the practice is associated with increased subjective well-being. Training in compassion meditation increases empathy, as measured by the ability to accurately judge the emotions of others, as well as positive affect in the presence of suffering. The practice of mindfulness has been shown to have similar pro-social effects. Scientific research on the various types of meditation is just beginning, but there are now hundreds of studies suggesting that these practices are good for us. Again, from a first-person point of view, none of this is surprising. After all, there's an enormous difference between being hostage to one's thoughts and being freely and non-judgmentally aware of life in the present. To make this shift is to interrupt the processes of rumination and reactivity that often keep us so desperately at odds with ourselves and with other people. No doubt many distinct mechanisms are involved: the regulation of attention and behavior, increased body awareness, inhibition of negative emotions, conceptual reframing of experiences, changes in the view of self, and so forth. And each of these processes will have its own neurophysiological causes. In the broadest sense, however, meditation is simply the ability to stop suffering in many of the usual ways, if only for a few moments at a time. How could that not be a skill worth cultivating?